guest today focuses on how humans will live and celebrate in space and other planets. Space tourism and planetary settlements will demand some creature comforts and some connections to earthly traditions for positive well-being. Chris Carberry is the author of Alcohol in Space, Past, Present, and Future, and he is also the CEO at Explore Mars. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing wonderfully. How are you?
Awesome. So let's hop right into it. This is not a normal segue or a segment that most people get into. So how did you get into this? How did you get into space?
Into space in general. Well, it's interesting because
In general.
my background is not actually space originally. I have degrees in history and poli-sci, and I actually worked in these areas in the first part of my career, working as an archivist, basically a political historian, but I was also engaged in politics, working for various campaigns. But I'd always been interested in space exploration, but I never really saw how I would be able to play a role. But then, I don't want to date myself these days, but over 20 years ago now, in the mid-1990s, started reading up again on it, wanted to find out what was going on with space exploration, and read a number of books, including Robert Zubrin's The Case for Mars, and realized that, that one of the things that were missing that the space community really needed to make sure we could get to Mars wasn't necessarily the engineers and the scientists, which we definitely need, but were people who knew how the government worked, policy experts. And so I entered the space community starting off as a volunteer, working policy, working politics, and took over the political outreach for actually a number of organizations and started that's how I got into the community, and it started growing over time. So eventually, of course, it became my day job and, running an organization and all aspects of it. But it all started off through that policy aspect that still is very important within the space community. Even with commercial spaceflight, policy support, help within government, Congress, administrations is essential.
I mean, that is key, and it's only getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we go further and further out.
Absolutely.
We first met this past spring at the Space Tourism Conference. We were both doing book signings. Your book, Alcohol in Space, Past, Present, and Future, talks about the good, the bad aspects of alcohol and the importance of it in our society. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, it started off more as an amusing concept for perhaps a short article or something, as people do at the end of conferences within the space community. Would get together occasionally and talk about things like, could you make wine on Mars? What would it taste like? Would it taste like the soil or the regolith it was grown in? Can you do beer in space? Can you make it? And these thoughts, discussions would occur occasionally, and I thought it might be a nice topic for a discussion or for an article. But as I looked more and more into it, I kept finding more and more dozens of companies that were actually investing in space-related projects to see if they could manufacture their product in space, if they could use the space environment to actually benefit their product here on Earth, as well as other companies looking at glassware and other aspects of this area. And I thought, well, after over time, I realized there was more than enough for a book, and I might as well be the first one to write it. And it's not just these companies, it's also the interesting history of alcohol in space, and there has been an interesting history for decades. People have been drinking in space, whether governments want to admit it or not, as well as looking at the history of it in literature, science fiction primarily, as well as basically providing context, the role alcohol has played throughout human civilizations from before written records started. So that it pretty much covers that, as well as enabling technologies, looking at the current state of agriculture in space and where we need to go in order to be able to maintain. If we wanted to actually create indigenous alcohol in space, you need agriculture and you need quite a bit of it. So it's all intermixed.
Well, and you touch on the science fiction aspect of it. Whether you are a Star Trek fan or a Star Wars fan, there's always a bar scene somewhere in there. So you talk about this also in your book.
Yeah, it's just an assumption. This has been part of human culture, human civilization from the beginning, as I mentioned, for good and for bad. It has people often emphasize the bad, but it has had extraordinarily beneficial aspects to human civilization and culture from the beginning as well. And it's not, regardless of the pros and cons, it's not going to stop the moment we go into space. And as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, that ship has sailed anyway, or that spaceship has launched anyway, because people have been drinking in space since practically the beginning. But now that more and more commercial space flights taking place and more people will go up, this will actually remove some of these taboos. NASA and other government space agencies officially prohibit alcohol in space, and they often deny that it's happening, but it is, and they all know it. NASA knows it, and of course the Russians know it, because it's been smuggled up for decades. But with commercial players, it just removes that restraint. And so it's just one of these things that's going to happen. So it's a worthy topic of discussion: the pros, the cons, the impact, what science is behind it, physiological science. Because one of the problems that in the fact that we deny that it's happening or it's prohibited is that there have been no official studies on how humans metabolize alcohol in space. We know it doesn't kill them. We know they don't get, doesn't affect them too much more than it does on Earth, but they've only consumed small amounts, like small shots each time. So there have been no official studies, because if once you have a study, you're acknowledging it's actually happening. And so this is also an opportunity with commercial space flight, that we can actually do the studies we probably should have done years ago, but we didn't want to create the controversy of admitting there's alcoholic beverages in space.
Right. In a recent article that I wrote from the Journal of Space Philosophy, and on a recent podcast that I produced, I talk about the marketing trends of climate crisis, social responsibility, and space as a platform. Some of the brands that you have worked with and that you have interviewed for your book in whiskey, beer, and wines have done some experiments, like with growing hops and that sort of thing, on the International Space Station. You want to expand a little bit on how these companies are getting involved in the research on the International Space Station?
Yeah, I find this extremely exciting, not just because, for the prospect of having a whiskey or a beer or champagne in space, but because all these non-traditional companies are investing and trying to see how they can all use the space environment and stake a claim to make sure that as the commercial space tourism industry builds, and maybe beyond that into human settlement, that they want their product to be used in space. And so some of the initial experiments have been, like, for instance, the Scottish whiskey company Ardbeg sent up a whiskey aging experiment back in 2011. Stayed up there for 4 years. I believe that's 2 years longer than it was supposed to go up. And when it came down, they found that the space-flown sample was much different than the ground sample, and not for the better. Apparently, it tasted kind of rubbery and had a fishy taste to it as well, not the qualities you want in your fine whiskey. But that was probably because it was so quickly put together, this experiment, within 2 weeks. They didn't take into account all the extremes and the shaking, and it was up there much longer than it was supposed to. So I don't necessarily think that was a valid experiment. Suntory spent a little more time, and they sent up an experiment in 2014, one of which is still up there, but we haven't heard much back from Suntory, the Japanese whiskey maker. But they wanted to see if the space environment would mellow their product differently than here on the surface of Earth. But there are other experiments as well, like Budweiser. They have sent up 4 barley experiments. And regardless if you're excited about a beer or whiskey in space, which of course you can use barley for, This is important because this is a direct investment in a technology required for sustainability for any human settlement, any human long-term human habitation. That's agriculture. And so when you have companies, non-traditional companies investing in agriculture or other related technologies, that is a very good thing because it shows there's interest and you can get innovation from non-traditional locations or non-traditional players rather. So that's an interesting one. But even companies like Maison Mumm, the champagne company, they are excited about having their product up in space. They want to, really take advantage of the commercial space tourism market. And when people are toasting in space, they want their product to be the one that's being toasted with. And they're even creating little glassware that you can drink like you would in 1G to enhance the conviviality of drinking their product in space. And so they're trying to find all these ways to work within that microgravity environment and, and have a bottle that'll operate like that and be able to fill a glass so you can drink it somewhat normally like you would here on the surface of Earth. And this isn't easy because it's microgravity, so fluid doesn't act the same way as it does here. So they've had to find clever ways to make it work, as well as, the big mystery for them is, or maybe it isn't a mystery, we'll see. One of the big problems with carbonated beverages, which would be the case, of course, with champagne and beer, is that humans have problems consuming carbonated beverages in space. Because as I'm sure you're aware, as everybody on Earth is aware who's had a carbonated beverage, when you have a glass of beer or a soft drink, the bubbles go up, disperse, the gas disperses into the atmosphere, but in microgravity it doesn't do that. It goes all to the center in a ball and starts expanding, and it does that in your stomach as well. So astronauts have reported wet burps and stomach cramps. Also not one of the things you want from your product. So it's a challenge for companies like Maison Mumm or beer companies like another beer company has been trying to develop a space beer, Vostok Beer in Australia, which is a collaboration between Sabre Astronautics and Four Pines Breweries, and to create a beer that has the right taste and a minimal amount of carbonation, enough to make it a beer, but little enough that it won't create the wet burps and stomach cramps. And so they basically selected a stout with less carbonation, similar to a British beer. And the reason they picked the stout, as I'm sure you're aware, astronauts often report that up in space they feel like they have a head cold, so they have a diminished sense of taste. So they wanted something that was strong enough tasting that it would overcome that. So, but there are dozens of companies that are expressing interest or doing these experiments or doing things here on Earth with agriculture, trying to figure out how they can play a role in the commercial space industry, but also use space to improve their product here on Earth. So it's an interesting time. And since I've written the book, many groups have come to me and have been working with different people, helping them to figure out an approach forward. There are a lot of different players that are interested in playing a role in this, in the alcohol industry and some related fields, trying to, promote this.
Well, and as agriculture, they dip their toe into the agricultural world in space. That technology, regardless of how you feel about alcohol, that technology will come back down here and make it to where we can grow plants more sustainably on planet, because there's not a lot of resources up in space. So you've got to be very conscious of how much water you're using, the nutrients, that sort of thing. And different strains will be developed as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things that my group Explore Mars looks at. All these innovations required for sustainability in space, whether it be in microgravity, the moon, or Mars, that these things can be drivers for the benefit of humanity. Space always has been and has played a tremendous role in the quality of life here on Earth. People don't understand how much it impacts their daily lives. But when you're looking at a problem through, say, the Mars lens, you're forced to come up with solutions you wouldn't necessarily come up with here on Earth, because even though, yeah, we have climate issues, we have other problems, but people are still not motivated to be completely efficient. When you're on Mars, and if you're not completely efficient, you might die. That is a wonderful motivator. So it really focuses the attention, and so as you're trying to create systems where you can utilize or extract water, recycle water, or grow crops in an arid area more efficiently, all of that could be applicable here on Earth, and frankly solve a lot of the food issues here on Earth, the resource issues that you mentioned, by creating systems that are far, far more efficient.
Yes, and it also provides a great source of content for these companies. I'm going to go back to space tourism. And you had mentioned the thing that about designing drinkware. Tradition and celebration is so important. I mean, champagne just isn't the same coming out of a plastic bag with a straw. You have to, it's the
Well,
experience.
no, or squirting it in this. Yeah, it might be cool the first time to drink the little orb of champagne, but after a while, that's going to get tired. And so I think a lot of people are thinking this through, because if you're going to spend any amount of time in space, yeah, you want these creature comforts, you want something, that really plays a role in how you enjoy beverages and just are able to relax. And so, in addition to Maison Mum, other companies have been looking at creating, microgravity cocktail glasses and scotch glasses and teacups. But you wouldn't, so you can drink them like you would here on Earth, but they're much different because it's microgravity. So they basically use fluid dynamics, and they know that even in a microgravity, fluid tends to adhere to a surface, and they create these channels. And usually fill these glasses from the bottom, so the fluid will come up to the grooves, and then you can sip it like you would a normal glass here on Earth, except it's being filled from the bottom, and it's not filling the entire glass, just the grooves. And so there are a number of companies that have looked at that, and as I mentioned, it's one of these things that have benefits beyond that as well, because of course, whether you want alcohol or not, this is beneficial for any drink you're having, but it's also interesting because they're looking at all these different new aspects of fluid dynamics, the physics of fluids, and that can be very beneficial for other things other than drinking a beverage of any kind. It could be used in systems or anything else. Not anything else, but a wide range of different things that when you're trying to make sure your fluids are moving properly in a microgravity environment. Whereas, on Earth, of course, there's always that constant of gravity that how everything reacts in 1G.
And fluid dynamics is so important to our survival. From cooling our bodies in spacesuits to filling it full of fluid for our well-being, our physical well-being. So you talked about, yes, organizations, groups, and clubs are a great way for similar companies to collaborate and promote the industry as a whole. And you talked about how you have a lot of companies that are getting in touch with you. In response to that, you're creating a new organization as well that are for spirits in space. You want to talk any about that?
Yeah, we'll be launching the Space Drinks Association very soon. It was supposed to be launched like 2 years ago, but because of COVID, it kind of got shelved for a while. But it will be very soon, and that will be a trade organization, essentially bringing all these interesting array of players. Because it's not just alcohol companies, it's not just space geeks. It's all these different people within the alcohol industry, the space industry, agriculture people, science fiction people, innovators, people looking at all these different products, glassware. It's amazing array of people and industries that will play a role in this. So we want to bring them together to create a place to discuss to brainstorm ways to advance the topic and advance these technologies, but also, conduct actual research, but even look at some of the concerns. Once again, this is, while we hope the group will be a lot of fun, we also want to be clear that it's serious as well, that we're going to want to look at, the dangers as well, what we should watch out for, what procedures, for instance, in the United States and within the United States military and other places, even more so at NASA, we're kind of schizophrenic about alcohol. But French Navy, I use in the book, is a good example. Not surprising, the French are less schizophrenic than we are on alcohol. But the French Navy often have bars on their ships, but it's highly regulated. It's not as though they can just go off the bar at any moment. I believe they're allowed like one drink per day, and they monitor it. And in the military, that's fairly pretty easy to do. You can make sure that people only get the amount that they're allowed, and that's reasonable. And so this is maybe kind of a way you could do things in space as well, or just all these different systems, what the concerns are, and once, as I said, learning primarily for, I think one of the most important things, as I mentioned before, understanding how humans metabolize alcohol in space. So we'll be looking at all of that and doing conferences, workshops, experiments, and a lot of other events.
Well, entertainment is a great way to tell your story. And you have a documentary in the works. You want to tell us a little bit about your documentary that's coming out?
Yeah, the book Alcohol in Space is currently being adapted into a documentary, and it will be released in 2023. And so it is film producer Sam Burbank, who's done a lot of documentaries for National Geographic, Discovery, and a lot of other, high-end documentary, organizations that run documentaries. Is directing it. And, it's just putting together an interesting group of people, not just from the book, but others who've run into, talk about why they're doing this, the passion behind it, but really the culture, that this is part of human culture, and this is what we're trying to advance. And just, when we're going into space, we don't want to bring just kind of some sterile version that that often when you look at, and it's not a criticism of NASA, but some of the old views of space colonization, they look pretty sterile, nothing, none of the things that humans really do. And so this is part of human culture, and we want to advance that. And so that's what the documentary, it's kind of how it's going to be approaching it, talking to all these companies, including like Maison Mumm, the champagne producer, but plenty of companies here in the U.S. and in Scotland. And it's coming together very well. So I'm looking forward to it. And we'll start screening. It'll be premiered next year, but we're going to have a preliminary screening of it at the Humans to Mars Summit in Washington, D.C. in May.
Awesome. Well, now is the time we have to do the little promo thing. So here we go. Hold on to your boosters. We'll be right back with guest Chris Carberry, and we will talk about Explore Mars after a brief message from our sponsors. You are the CEO of Explore Mars. Can you tell us what that is?
Explore Mars is a 501c nonprofit. We were founded in 2010. And unlike a lot of the other nonprofits that are out there for space, we're not a membership organization. We decided when we're being founded, let's focus on projects, let's focus on programs. And so since then, we run programs like the Humans to Mars Summit every year, which is the largest annual conference focused on human missions to Mars. We run workshops like the Achieving Mars workshops, which bring stakeholders together and trying to build consensus on the sustainable ways of getting to the moon and using the moon to go to Mars. We also do a lot of STEM education work. The president of our group is Janet Ivey, one of the best known STEM evangelists in the country. And we do a lot of work on innovation. Our Mars Innovation Forum program has been diving into some of the innovations I mentioned before. Things, what do we need that, what are the innovations required for sustainability in space? Well, I think we have transportation covered, but when you see these nice videos, whether it be SpaceX or NASA, of these vehicles landing on Mars, it's missing a lot of things, like how are the people breathing, how are they eating, what kind of medicine are they going to receive, what sort of safeguards are they taking for this psychological well-being of the crew, and all these things that are required for healthy human life, which we often don't talk about. But so we want to talk about that, the innovations, but how they can also benefit Earth. So that's another area of focus for us. But we have a bunch of other programs coming up now, as we're seem to be finally rising above, or at least living with COVID, meaning in the COVID environment. We're about to launch a number of new projects, and hopefully, and probably some technical projects as well in the upcoming months. So we're very excited the way things are moving, and that we're going to be finally able to get back to some semblance of normal and launching a whole bunch of new programs.
Well, and I gotta say, COVID was a great training ground for how we would live on Mars. With lockdown, it's not like you can just go outside when you're living on Mars. And so I'm sure that there's been some interesting research done in that too.
There has been, and there certainly will be papers coming out for years. And it was a topic we had at least 2 times in webinars and conferences, the topic of how COVID has trained us for Mars, since essentially the entire Earth was living in a Mars analog, it seemed. And so it was really a wonderful area. While we would have preferred not having a worldwide pandemic, it certainly provided a lot of lessons for isolation, communications, telemedicine, all these different aspects that we've been talking about for Mars exploration for years. Yeah, admittedly, most people were living in habitats that were much bigger than they'd be living in on Mars or in transit, but they still had a lot of the same issues. And as a result, like the platform we're on right now and others, improved so much because, everybody and the whole world got training on them as well. People were not as comfortable with these platforms before COVID, but all of a sudden now it's, the preferred method, and they've gotten so much better with all just the massive usage. And so the companies have responded and improved their products. So I think and these things will be beneficial when we go to the moon or Mars or anywhere else. But even things, as I said, like remote medicine, boy, was that important during COVID, as we learned what can we do virtually, and what are the ways we can, some things you need to be in person, at least here, but there were a lot of things that could be done virtually. And so I think while once again would have preferred not to have had to gone through that, it certainly had some benefits for the future of space exploration, by how everybody dealt with it, and having this rare occasion where we have 7 billion analog astronauts around the world, all learning different lessons or the same lessons or combination.
And for those listeners out there, when we refer to analog missions, we're talking about mock missions here on planet that simulate Mars or the moon environments. All right. Events and conferences are a powerful way for members of the quote-unquote tribe to come together. I talk about the benefits of marketing. I talk about the benefits of this marketing strategy in my book, Space Marketing. You have a conference coming up. Can you tell us about this conference?
Yes, the 2023 Humans to Mars Summit will be coming up on May 16th through 18th. Still a little while away, but it'll come pretty quickly in Washington, D.C. at the National Academy of Sciences building. If you haven't been there in that building, beautiful building. It's worth coming to the conference just for the building, but we also put on a really good show as well. And so we'll be having a screening of that film that I mentioned, Alcohol in Space, with a reception and panel. we'll have a lot of other events going on. We always have spectacular programming, but it's going to be, it looks like the biggest one yet. We're planning all these side events, but we always have, top speakers from NASA, industry, the entertainment industry, STEM education, innovators, talking about not only things like what's going on mission architecture design, how we're going to go to Mars, and the most recent science, as well as international collaborations, but also how it impacts society. And that's, once again, we'll be having innovators talking about all these inventions that I mentioned, as well as investors. In the last few years, venture capitalists, if you talked to me about 5 or 6 years ago, there weren't very many venture capitalists who were investing in Mars-related things because it did not seem realistic. Didn't seem, or even if it didn't seem like it was a profitable venture. It was something only governments could do. Now, I know of several venture capitalists investing in Mars-related technologies because I realize as you're investing in these, there is a market here on Earth as well. And so I think they're realizing, if you were investing in the entire mission, that's not likely to make anybody money. Even Elon Musk doesn't think he's going to make money, at least in the short term, if he were to mount his own mission to Mars. But in all these little pieces that are required, all those things I mentioned, how we're going to eat, drink, medicine, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, etc., environmental systems, as we're making great strides forward to manage this colossal undertaking, almost all of them will have benefits here on Earth. In many respects, they're innovations we would not have come up with, at least very quickly, here on Earth. So we were able to make giant leaps in technology than incremental growth because we're forced to.
Exactly. So, and the technology, and you referred back to this earlier, the technology that we live with every day, the fact that we're talking to each other right now is all done through space. What we carry around in our pocket on our phone is loaded with space technology that most people do not think of when they use it. But space is all throughout our life. From our weather prediction.
It's only going to get bigger.
Yes, as the satellites go up.
Why do people know where the hurricane is moving? I mean, it wasn't very long ago that we didn't know. We knew it was there. You had ships. You had, you could through, pressure, air, atmospheric pressure and things like that. But it was still inexact because you had to go with a ship or with an airplane to make sure you knew where the hurricane was going. Whereas now we've been, obviously, for many decades, we can look down and see. We still don't necessarily predict the accurate course, but it's very rare, we don't all of a sudden get snuck up on by we always know it's there.
Yes.
Always know there's a possibility it's going to hit you when it's coming. And so, weather forecasting has certainly been dramatic, but there are so many other things, GPS and any imaginable number of technologies which were either, some of them weren't necessarily invented by NASA, but were advanced by it or influenced by it heavily. So it's a whole combination of things. Just computers in general, they weren't invented by NASA, but Silicon Valley itself would not be the same if it weren't for the Apollo program, which stimulated Silicon Valley to turn into what it is today, because the Apollo program needed, miniaturization of computer circuitry, and so that really started the ball moving. So all these things just played into that.
Well, and as we start to go to the moon and go to Mars, communication will be critical. So as we develop these new technologies for communication and they get better and better and better, it will also get better down here as far as our communications on planet. So it's a win-win for everyone.
It is. And, and I think when people understand, well, it's not inexpensive. It is expensive. I would never say it wasn't expensive, but when you look at what percentage of the federal budget it is, not counting when you add in the commercial stuff, it's, it's less than half of 1% of the federal budget. And this is where perception comes into it, because I think usually when people are hesitant, they have misperception of how much it costs. When you still ask people on the street, they'll give wildly high percentages of the budget. They think it's like, many people think it's competitive, budget-wise with the military or with social programs, which is just ridiculous. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of all of those. And so, because I remember once there was this poll, it was a phone call I received, and they were saying, would you support, should we support Mars when we might not be able to pay for Social Security? Well, they're completely different. Mars, there's no relationship between the space program and Social Security, because space exploration costs literally a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of what we spend on Social Security and other spending programs. Not saying there aren't budgetary issues, but it's not in the same category. And so when people understand that it's not a choice between Social Security and Mars, or it's really only like half of 1% of the federal budget, it kind of releases them from that guilt factor when they think, if they think we're spending the amount that we're spending on Social Security, well, I wouldn't support that either. But when it's such a small percentage and gets such a big impact, it's probably one of the most impactful per dollar federal programs we have, if not the most impactful for a general impact, and whether it be through technology or just how it impacts psychology, national morale, and international perceptions as well.
Well, and I'd like to go there for a minute. A number that I saw this week, it has grown to 77 countries have started space programs. So if we do not have enough in our budget to go to Mars, go to the moon, then we will not be the industry leaders, and we will be subject to other countries that are the leaders. Like, for example, China is gaining a lot of ground in these studies, and they put a lot of their budget towards that direction. So whether or not you're equating it to Social Security or not, we still have to stay the industry leaders, even just for the spin-off technologies that come off of the space program itself. We
and of course, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people in the space community don't like talking about the security side of it, but guess what? The technologies for these things are almost exactly the same, or if not exactly, to national security stuff as well. So if you let China or other countries get ahead, they are also gaining an edge, not only in space technology, which would be a bad thing, but in the ability to, from a military perspective, to also, advance beyond us and pretty much be able to just overwhelm us in that respect. So it's advantageous to us in all respects to make sure that we stay at the forefront. Yet we want to collaborate with others, create as many international partnerships as we can, but we do not want to fall behind, competitive nations or even partner nations, because it's not in our best interest, and it will, our economy would certainly would not benefit from that. And of course, it certainly we would be weaker from a national security perspective as well.
And just for all those that are listening and don't like to talk about national defense, what would happen if another country that had bad intentions towards us captured our satellites? What would happen with your phone? How would you even know? So just that particular point is a very fragile point, and we have to protect it.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. People take it, on Earth, people take it for granted. We have free trade. And why is there free trade? A big part of that is because of the U.S. Navy and other friendly navies that are actually able to patrol the waterways, so there is free commerce. Now, there are places where it's more challenging. There are places with piracy and things like that. But overall, we generally are able to have free trade where, it's not, we don't have fear of the commerce being disrupted by negative powers. Or I don't know if that was the right way of phrasing it.
Yes.
But but we've gotten so accustomed to that, and it probably is going to be the same thing in space. We don't just, once we go into space, it's not as though we're just going to become utopian society. We're probably going to bring the same geopolitical, and I guess you'll have to need a new term for that, but issues. And so we just have to find a way to secure these assets, whether the assets you mentioned now, that it wouldn't take much to throw us into chaos if our space assets were all of a sudden taken out or hacked or controlled by another power. That would be catastrophic. Or anything beyond there as we start expanding outward. There's nothing guaranteeing that bad actors won't take advantage. And, whether we have a moon colony or something like that, take advantage of that. Or, it's just realistic. I mean, we all want to avoid as much military activity in space as possible, but it's not realistic to assume we're not going to have it, because as the more and more people go out there, will need security. Because once again, it's not likely that utopia will suddenly break out. So.
No, we haven't experienced that with COVID either. So, we've seen a lot of the opposites. Well, let's go into, I'm just going to touch real quick on an event that we're working together on, and we're getting ready to work on an event with the Kentucky Derby, hopefully, fingers crossed. Beth Pope with the 0G is working with Chris, Janet Ivy, and myself with Space for Kentucky to get 0G flights during the Derby festivities. And bourbon is a huge part of that celebration. And it would be great. It would be a great fit for sponsorship. So stay tuned to learn more about that in coming episodes. So what final words would you like to leave our audience with? How to contact you, how to work with you, etc.
If you're interested in any of these topics, the Humans to Mars Summit, Explore Mars, alcohol in space, the Space Drinks Association, probably the best thing to do for Explore Mars is contact me at carberryexploremars.org. Frankly, contact me for the other questions as well. It's the simplest way. I hope people will be able to come to Humans to Mars Summit, and stay tuned because we'll be making announcements regarding the Space Drinks Association finally. Probably be announcing it early in 2023. Give us some time to kind of get everything together again and launch this program. But there are a lot of exciting things coming up. I think we are in exciting times. We are truly entering, it appears, the golden age of space exploration. So I think the next 10 to 20 years should be really interesting.
And I'm looking forward to the ride. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I will have all your information, links, and contact in the show notes at spacemarketingpodcast.com. And thanks again. Thank you, Chris, very much for joining us today. Please subscribe before you head on over to my YouTube channel for bonus footage. Links to the YouTube and other social media channels can be found on spacemarketingpodcast.com. A special thanks to Chris Carberry, the author of Alcohol in Space and CEO of Explore Mars, for joining us today and sharing his journey to space. Be sure to check out his links listed in today's show notes. I hope that you have found this podcast useful for your journey as you reach for the stars.